And we're going to go live to Brussels to listen in to Secretary General of NATO, Jens Stoltenberg.
We addressed our support for Ukraine, the severe costs we are imposing on Russia, and NATO's work to strengthen our defenses now and for the years to come. Our close partners Finland, Sweden and Georgia and the European Union joined us for the first session. And Ukrainian Defense Minister Oleksiy Reznikov described in stark terms the death and destruction caused by President Putin's war. The determined resistance of the Ukrainians against the invasion and the importance of our continued support. We all paid tribute to the courage of the Ukrainian people and the Ukrainian armed forces. NATO allies and partners have supported Ukraine with equipment and training for many years. We are helping Ukraine to uphold its fundamental right to self-defense, freedom and democracy, with significant amounts of critical military equipment. Today, ministers agreed that we must continue to provide significant support to Ukraine, including with military supplies, financial help, and humanitarian aid. NATO allies and partners are also hosting millions of Ukrainian refugees. President Putin must stop this war immediately, withdraw his forces now, and engage in diplomacy in good faith. NATO is responding to this crisis with speed and unity. And next week, allied heads of state and government will meet for an extraordinary NATO summit. We will address both our immediate response and the changes we need to make for our longer-term security. Moscow should be in no doubt. NATO will not tolerate any attack on allied sovereignty or territorial integrity. We have already activated our defense plans to shield the alliance, increase our readiness, and deploy troops from both sides of the Atlantic. There are now hundreds of thousands of forces at heightened alert across the alliance, 100,000 US troops in Europe, and around 40,000 troops under direct NATO command, mostly in the eastern part of the alliance, backed by major air and naval power, as well as air defenses. But we face a new reality for our security, so we must reset our collective defense and deterrence for the longer term. Today, we tasked our military commanders to develop options across all domains: land, air, sea, cyber, and space. On land, our new posture should include substantially more forces in the eastern part of the alliance, at higher readiness, with more pre-positioned equipment and supplies. In the air, more allied air power and strengthened integrated air and missile defense. At sea, carrier strike groups, submarines, and significant numbers of combat ships on persistent basis. We will also consider the future of our cyber defenses and how best to draw on allied space assets. We should also train and exercise more often and in greater numbers. Major increases to our deterrence and defense will require major investments. Allies need to invest a minimum of 2% of GDP on defense. And I welcome that allies such as Germany and Denmark have already made important announcements on more investments and faster timetables. We also need to spend more together. NATO common funding is the essential enabler that allows us to work together. It is a force multiplier for national defense efforts, and it shows solidarity as allies. At this critical moment for our security, unity between North America and Europe in NATO is more important than ever. And with that, I'm ready to take your questions.
Okay, we'll start with BBC in the center, just behind.
Thank you.
Last row. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Secretary General. Could I just ask you, we've heard once again from President Zelensky addressing US Congress, calling for a no-fly zone. Are there any allies at all who have been asking for one, even if the decision of the alliance as a whole is not to enforce one? Has there been any discussion at all about it? And the second question I have is just about Ukraine and its NATO membership. Do you believe that Ukraine has cooled towards its view of joining NATO as a negotiating tool with the hope of eventually reaching some kind of agreement with Russia? Thank you very much.
Allies are united, both in providing support to Ukraine to uphold the right for self-defense, but allies are also united when it comes to that NATO should not deploy forces on the ground or in the airspace of Ukraine. Because we have a responsibility to ensure that this conflict, this war, doesn't escalate beyond Ukraine. We see death, we see destruction, we see human suffering in Ukraine, but this can become even worse if NATO took actions that actually turned this into a full-fledged war between NATO and Russia. So allies are united when it comes to the issue of how to provide support to Ukraine. Ministers addressed this today. They reinforced the message of the importance of providing support with equipment, advanced equipment, air defense systems, anti-tank weapons, and many other types of support, but no NATO deployment of air or ground capabilities in Ukraine, and that's the united position from NATO allies. Then the message to Ukraine is the same now as it has been for years, that Ukraine is a sovereign, independent nation. It has its own right to choose its own path, and we respect the decisions made by the democratic elected government by Ukraine. So it's up to them to decide whether they aspire for NATO membership or not, and then it's up for 30 allies to decide on that issue. Not for Russia to try to veto such a process.
CNN.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary General. Natasha Bertram, CNN. I'm wondering whether NATO has invited President Zelensky to participate in any way in the Leaders Summit next week, as Reznikov did in the Defense Ministerial today. And I'm also wondering if you could respond to the Polish proposal to send NATO forces into Ukraine on a so-called peacekeeping mission. Thanks.
So what we need is peace in Ukraine, and therefore Russia and President Putin has to stop the war, withdraw its forces. We support all efforts to find a negotiated solution. We support all efforts to find a diplomatic solution. And of course we support and welcome the talks and negotiations which are now taking place between Ukraine and Russia. At the same time we support Ukraine because we know what they can achieve on the negotiating table is of course very closely linked to the situation on the battlefield. So I strongly also believe that one of the reasons why the Ukrainians also are saying that they have seen some steps in the right direction is because they have been able to fight back. They have been able to fight back against the invading Russian forces. So the courage, the determination and the support from NATO allies to the Ukrainian armed forces is extremely important also when it comes to what they can achieve as part of the negotiated process with Russia. Again, of course, we support peace efforts. We call on Russia and President Putin to withdraw its forces, but we have no plans of deploying NATO troops on the ground in Ukraine.
Okay. Ryan?
Secretary General, good evening. Can you comment on Italy's role in this current crisis? And happy birthday for today.
Thank you. I would very much like to comment on Italy's role. Italy is a highly valued NATO ally, a founding member, and Italy is contributing to our collective defense in many different ways. I was recently in Romania. I met Italian pilots. They are helping there to keep NATO airspace safe, and they really show commitment and strength in their contributions to different NATO missions and operations, including in Kosovo, where Italy has been a key ally for many years.